So the other day I did a video about Wilfrid Laurier, who many people would argue was the greatest and most consequential Prime Minister in Canadian history. And today I want to swing way over to the other side of the spectrum and talk to you about Kim Campbell, who many people say was the single worst, most irrelevant Prime Minister in Canadian history. But you don't need to take my word for it. This book right here, published in 1999, asked a bunch of Canadian historians who were the best and worst prime ministers in Canadian history, and they ranked Kim Campbell dead last. The low regard in which Kim Campbell's prime ministership is held is interesting because in some ways she was actually quite a historically relevant figure for Canada. As you might have noticed, she is a woman and the only female prime minister Canada has ever had. She was also the only prime minister from British Columbia, the first prime minister to be born after the Second World War, and the only prime minister to have had some political history in Canada's long-forgotten Social Credit Party. She was also the prime minister with the shortest career in Canadian national politics, and I think this is the thing that most people remember her for today. She only served a single 4-year term in Parliament and was only Prime Minister for a measly 4 months in 1993. Yet at the same time, her failed prime ministership in some ways triggered the beginning of the modern era of Canadian politics, in the sense that so much of the way that Canadian politics works today was shaped by forces that were unleashed by Kim Campbell's fall from grace. But before I begin, I would just like to acknowledge that today's video is brought to you by Skillshare, the awesome teach you how to do anything website. The first 500 viewers who sign up to Skillshare using the link in the thing below will get access to a free 2-month trial. We shall talk more about Skillshare in a bit. But first, Kim Campbell. As I said, Kim Campbell was our only prime minister to be born right here in British Columbia. She worked briefly as a Vancouver lawyer and then got involved in the British Columbia political scene, which in those days was very much dominated by the BC Social Credit Party. Social Credit was sort of a strange Canadian political movement that would take too long to describe right now. But here in British Columbia, it had evolved into a sort of broad-based coalition political party containing some people who were more conservative and some people who were more liberal. Kim Campbell served as a Social Credit member of the British Columbia Parliament, and for a time was an advisor to BC's Social Credit Premier, Bill Bennett. At one point, she even tried to run to become head of the BC Social Credit Party, but got clobbered. In 1988, Kim Campbell resigned from the BC legislature to run for a seat in the Canadian Parliament, switching her party label from Social Credit to Progressive Conservative. The Progressive Conservative Party was the party that was running Canada at the time, under the leadership of Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, and Campbell won, beginning what would become a very brief but very eventful career in national Canadian politics. So Kim Campbell had a number of good things going for her when she arrived in Ottawa. One, she was a woman. This seems very quaint today, but as recently as 1988, it was still considered a big deal that women were getting elected to the Canadian Parliament in any sizable number. During the 1970s, Canada had never elected more than 10 women to a parliament of over 300. 2, Campbell was from British Columbia. BC is a big and important province in this country, and Kim Campbell had some connection to the ruling establishment there. And 3, she was considered very politically moderate. Campbell had been part of the liberal wing of the Social Credit Party, and now she was very much part of the liberal wing of the Progressive Conservative Party too. So shortly after being re-elected, Prime Minister Mulroney was like, aha, this Kim Campbell person seems like real cabinet material. Checks a lot of boxes. In 1989, Prime Minister Mulroney made Kim Campbell Assistant Minister of Indian Affairs, and then in 1990, she got a big upgrade when she was made Attorney General of Canada. It was the very first time a woman had ever been made Attorney General. She even did this saucy photo shoot with a judge's robe to celebrate. So as I said, Kim Campbell was very much on the progressive end of the Progressive Conservative Party. She was pro-choice and considered herself an ardent feminist, and was very determined to ensure that the Mulroney government would not be too right-wing. In her memoir, Time and Chance, Campbell basically takes credit for all of the liberal things that the Mulroney administration did during its time in power, including helping craft Canada's strict gun control laws, broadening Canada's anti-discrimination statutes to include protections for gays and lesbians, allowing gays and lesbians to serve openly in the Canadian military, and liberalizing Canada's abortion laws. Although that last part didn't wind up being that relevant because the Mulroney government's abortion reforms never wound up actually passing, and today Canada enjoys the even more liberal status quo of having no abortion laws at all. But that is another story. For various reasons we won't fully get into here, by the early 1990s, Prime Minister Mulroney had become incredibly unpopular. It was pretty clear from the polls that if he attempted to run for a third term, he would go down to massive defeat. So on February 24th, 1993, Mulroney announced that he would resign the prime ministership and that his party, the Progressive Conservatives, would install a new prime minister to contest the 1993 election. And Kim Campbell became the establishment favorite to replace him almost immediately. Not because she was necessarily the highest profile member of his administration, but rather because she wasn't. In contrast to all of Mulroney's other tired old cabinet ministers, Kim Campbell was still considered a relatively fresh and novel figure on the Canadian political scene. She was thus viewed as someone who could inject a jolt of life into this lagging, unpopular party. So she was very much the frontrunner for the job, but early on there was already starting to be some ominous omens. I will read you a little passage from this book here called Dynasties and Interludes, which, by the way, is a very, very good book on Canadian political history. As if to signal what was to come, Campbell ran a poor leadership campaign and frittered away her early lead. It became evident she was not fully informed about the way the party operated, and she had not developed a vision of what her prime ministership might achieve. Thus, instead of a coronation, Kim Campbell won the leadership on a close second ballot. It was also clear that little thought had been given to the post-convention period and to the election campaign that would shortly follow. Kim Campbell was inaugurated as Prime Minister of Canada on June 25th, 1993, but there was really no time for her to do anything with the job because it was already Canadian election time. Now, partially as a result of Brian Mulroney's incredible unpopularity, in the early 1990s, Canada was starting to develop some new political parties. These were founded by people that had previously supported the Progressive Conservative Party, but had now concluded that the whole party was basically a lost cause. In Western Canada, two right-wing guys named Preston Manning and Stephen Harper created a new party called the Reform Party of Canada. It was basically a populist party for conservative voters who had grown disillusioned with wishy-washy progressive conservative politicians like, well, Kim Campbell. And then in Quebec, a guy named Lucien Bouchard, who had previously worked for the Mulroney administration, created a new party called the Bloc Québécois, devoted to Quebec separatism. His argument was that Mulroney had betrayed Quebec so badly, there was basically no reason to even try to make things work in Canada anymore. Now, a lot of people would argue that the emergence of these new parties basically guaranteed that Canada would experience a lot of vote splitting in the 1993 election, which means that it's not really Kim Campbell's fault that she lost as badly as she did. But even if that is indeed the case, Kim Campbell herself certainly didn't make things much better. I will try to be delicate about this, but basically, Kim Campbell was not a good campaigner, nor was she terribly likable. She had a sort of condescending personality and was often characterized as being sort of broadly out of touch with a lot of the anger and pain that voters across the country were feeling at that time. For example, Canada in the 1990s was in the midst of a rather severe recession with unemployment over 10%, and Campbell was asked about it once, and she gave this very aloof answer that wound up being one of the defining moments of the campaign.
And I would like to see, certainly, by the turn of the century, a country where unemployment is way down, and where we're paying down our national debt, and there's a whole new vision of the future opening up for Canadians. But it requires us to use the resources that we have, and the first thing that we have to do is recognize what extraordinary resources we have as a country.
And then there was this other gaffe, still very widely remembered today, when a reporter was trying to ask her for specifics about something, and Campbell sort of snobbily responded that an election is no time to discuss serious issues. Now, in fairness to Campbell, that comment was taken out of context, but it nevertheless helped reinforce a dominant image that a lot of people had of her. And then there was the face ad. So Campbell's main opponent, at least in her own mind, was the leader of the Liberal Party, Jean Chrétien. Chrétien had this very particular way of talking, partially because he had a very thick French-Canadian accent, and partially because he had this facial deformity that paralyzed part of his mouth.
And you will understand that we can be different, but we can be proud Francophone and be proud Canadian at the same time.
Anyway, the Campbell campaign ran this ad.
Is this a prime minister? Does he understand that his plan to allow a deficit each year would increase our debt? How can he believe that you can kickstart a modern economy by fixing some roads? Why doesn't he answer the questions he's asked? Doesn't he understand the questions? Or the answers? Or both? Jean Chrétien, a prime minister? Think twice.
A lot of people thought this was very offensive, but it was also a major strategic blunder in that it gave Chrétien an opportunity to deliver the political zinger that he had been clearly waiting his entire life to give.
God gave me a physical defect. And I've accepted that since I'm a kid. It's true that I speak on one side of my mouth. I'm not a Tory, I don't speak on both sides of my mouth.
But apart from all of the gaffes, in a bigger sense, Campbell's campaign was doomed by the fact that she really had no obvious base. The right hated her, the left hated her, Quebec hated her, and by the end, the media really hated her. As a result, when voting day finally came, the Progressive Conservative Party went down to the biggest electoral defeat in Canadian history. Campbell's party, which had won 169 seats under Brian Mulroney in the last election, plummeted to 2. Yes, 2. The popular vote was a little bit better. She went from 43% to 16%. So, only a 27-point drop. Prime Minister Campbell even lost her own seat, which is a pretty remarkable thing to happen in a parliamentary system, given that the Prime Minister's seat is supposed to be in the safest of safe areas. The disastrous nature of Kim Campbell's 1993 loss cast a long shadow on Canadian politics that we're still sort of dealing with the aftermath of. For one, it basically permanently destroyed her party, the Progressive Conservative Party, and allowed the Reform Party to displace it as the dominant party of the Canadian centre-right. After trudging along in zombified form for a few more years, in 2004, the Progressive Conservative Party officially merged with the Reform Party, which was then led by future Prime Minister Stephen Harper. This represented a major victory for Harper and people like him who had wanted Canada to have a more aggressive and ideological Conservative Party. As I mentioned, only 2 Progressive Conservatives were able to hang on to seats in Parliament in the 1993 election. This wound up doing good things for their political careers out of sheer process of elimination. One of the 2, Jean Charest, became the new head of the party, and he deserves some credit for keeping the Progressive Conservatives on life support for the next decade. In 1998, Charest left national politics, and in 2003, he was elected Prime Minister of Quebec. He only left office in 2012. But perhaps the most surprising success story was Kim Campbell's former campaign manager, John Tory. He has somehow managed to remain a viable figure in Canadian politics, despite, presiding over the worst defeat in Canadian history. After serving a stint as head of the Ontario Conservative Party, in 2014 he was elected Mayor of Toronto, a job he holds to this day. But what, you ask, became of Kim Campbell herself? Shortly after her defeat, new Prime Minister Jean Chrétien took pity on her and appointed her to a diplomatic post. Not something good like an ambassador, mind you. She was just made an adjunct diplomat at the Canadian consulate in Los Angeles. And when that ran its course, she needed to figure out something else to do with herself. She hadn't been in politics long enough to qualify for a pension. And in the end, basically what she decided to do was just milk her former prime minister status for all that it was worth. Which actually makes a lot of sense when you think about it. Being a former leader of a well-known country is something that seems very impressive, even if you don't know a lot of the details about the person who held the job. Like, say, if you met the former president of Brazil, you'd probably be pretty impressed by that, even if you didn't really know anything else about him. The fact is, most of us are pretty ignorant about the politics of other countries, and this seems to be the principle that Kim Campbell's post-prime ministerial career has been based around. So in the over 25 years since she left office, Kim Campbell has toured the world as a motivational speaker, an advisor, and consultant, always leaning very heavily into this idea that she is a former Prime Minister of Canada. Ooh. Her agent famously even once got her on an episode of Bill Maher's show with George Carlin. Once in a while, the Canadian media even likes to wheel her out when she's got something to say about various things. She's gotten even more liberal as she's gotten older, so most of those things she has to say are not very nice to other conservatives. I actually don't even know if she still self-identifies as a conservative. She's certainly quite consumed with hatred for Donald Trump at the moment and tweets about him constantly. She's made headlines in Canada with some of her more vulgar tweets about the man, including a recent one where she called him a mother. Overall, I would say that Kim Campbell is mostly an awkward, uncomfortable figure in Canadian political history. To understand why, it is important to appreciate the degree that Canadians really treat the prime ministership as like a very important symbol of their country. You always learn about the prime ministers in school, their pictures are on the money, they have all these statues and things named after them and so on. When I was going to school, there would always be pictures of all the different prime ministers in the classroom. This is apparently such a common practice, it even got a mention in a song by that supposedly most iconic of Canadian bands the tragically hip.
Walls are lying all yellow, gray, and sinister. Hung with pictures of our parents, prime ministers.
Fun fact about that song, by the way, it is the story of a supposedly wrongly convicted man whose case became this big media sensation when Kim Campbell was Attorney General. Anyway, the weirdness of Kim Campbell's prime ministership rubbed a lot of people the wrong way, and still does to this day. She was the first female prime minister of Canada, which should be a big deal, but she was also never elected to the job by the Canadian people, held the job for an extremely short period of time, and was thrown out of that job in the biggest landslide in Canadian history. So if you believe the prime ministership of Canada is like this very sacred, important thing, then it's very easy to see Kim Campbell as somebody who sort of cheapened and made mockery of the office in a whole bunch of ways. And yet we can never escape her. She will have always been our former prime minister, with a grand oil portrait in the Canadian Parliament and all the rest. Certainly she's put a lot of effort into ensuring that nobody else forgets her brief moment of glory. Now, in fairness, during the 1980s, Canada had two other prime ministers who served incredibly brief terms as well, Joe Clark and John Turner. But while their prime ministerships were obviously jokes in the same way Kim Campbell's was, they did redeem themselves somewhat by staying involved in Canadian politics for a long time after. So even if they didn't do much as prime ministers, when people speak about former Prime Minister Turner or former Prime Minister Clark today, there is a lot more respect. There is a sense that their subsequent political work helped validate their claim to be a legitimate former prime minister, if that makes sense, because they proved themselves to be undoubtedly important political figures in Canadian history. Not so with Kim Campbell. She was just sort of this odd figure who floated into Canadian politics for a few years and then floated out just as quickly. And now I hope you will indulge me as I float into some words about today's video sponsor, Skillshare. Now, as you guys surely know, Skillshare is a fantastic website featuring more than 25,000 video lessons that can teach you how to do just about anything. We're talking classes about art, classes about business, classes about cooking, classes about time management, classes about just about everything. Obviously, we are in an exciting new year now, and what better way to start 2019 than by finally learning that new skill you've always been meaning to. Whether your motivation is personal or professional, is there ever any reason to not get better at doing something? I, for instance, continue to be doing my best to learn more about doing 100% digital illustration, which is when you draw things only using the computer. I was doing this very popular Skillshare course the other day about how to use Procreate, which is this app that you use to draw with the iPad using the Apple Pencil. The guy who was teaching the class was a very talented illustrator in his own right, which is another very good thing about Skillshare, is that all of the teachers who are leading these classes are very competent and experienced in what they're teaching you. Becoming a paid member of Skillshare gives you unlimited access to the site's huge archive of lessons, and all for a very affordable price. An annual subscription costs less than $10 a month, which is very reasonable as far as online subscriptions go. But wait! If you sign up today using the link in the thing below, you get access to 2 months of Skillshare for absolutely free. So what are you waiting for? Join the 7 million who are already learning with Skillshare and give the site a try today. And give me your ideas of what kind of Canadian thing you would like to see me do a video about in the future. Until then, I will see you all next week.